So I just covered the case of Jared Loughner, gave an overview and some analysis of symptoms he might have been experiencing that were consistent with schizophrenia, a diagnosis he was ultimately given on formal evaluation. But I didn't go into risk factors and the etiology of schizophrenia that the Jared Loughner case may be instructive about. So in this video, I do want to talk about the etiology, the origins of schizophrenia, while continuing to use Jared Loughner as a sort of case study. But this video will probably end up being mostly about schizophrenia. This is a drawing by August Natterer entitled "My Eyes at the Moment of the Apparitions." August Natterer was a German electrician turned artist with schizophrenia who lived from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. For the latter half of his life, he was hospitalized in asylums, maintaining that he was the illegitimate son of Emperor Napoleon and, quote, the redeemer of the world, end quote. And this illustrates two of the most prominent symptoms of psychosis: hallucinations, what August Natterer refers to as apparitions, and delusions, in this case grandiose, that he is the son of Napoleon and the redeemer of the world. Schizophrenia is a disease where psychosis is the primary feature. What psychosis means fundamentally is a loss of touch with reality, at least the reality that any culture or subculture would define as such. Psychosis can be temporary and caused by many things, but when it becomes chronic and the primary defining feature of an illness, that is what we call schizophrenia. Drug intoxication can cause a psychosis. A severe depressive episode can cause psychosis, at least for a period, as can trauma, and later in life, neurodegenerative disorders, dementias, can cause psychosis. But with each of these things, the psychosis is secondary or downstream or a side effect of something else. So think of schizophrenia, on the other hand, as the entity where the primary process is the psychosis. And being a primary process, it's usually going to be the case that it is also a progressive process. In schizophrenia, psychosis is going to persist or even worsen over time, at least so long as it's untreated. So in DSM-5 terms, once a primary psychosis, not caused by other things, has lasted for more than 6 months, that's when the diagnosis of schizophrenia is made. And the other thing about the progressive process is that there is often a kind of deficit in cognition that sets in. While hallucinations and delusions are positive symptoms, i.e., things that are now present that didn't used to be, so positive or additions, there are also negative symptoms, meaning things that are now absent but used to be present. So the loss of motivation, the absence of drive, the absence of a full emotional affect are negative symptoms. And in between the positive and negative symptoms is probably where I would put things like thought disorder or a disorganization of behaviors or speech, because with those symptoms, there is sort of a presence of something like the disorganized speech or word salad, but that actually results from an absence of something else, like meaningful connections between concepts. So all in all, schizophrenia has some combination of positive symptoms, negative symptoms, and disorganization. And it's widely acknowledged that rather than being a single disease, schizophrenia is more like a syndrome, meaning a particular constellation of symptoms that show up together, but that it's actually comprised probably of multiple disease pathways that all end up in this syndrome of symptoms. So I'm going to break what I see as some potential pathways into categories, wherein there may be risk factors in each category, and bits of each of these can all combine or coalesce in multiple ways towards the endpoint and into the syndrome of schizophrenia. And we'll see if there's evidence in our case study of Jared Loughner of one or more risk factors that could explain the etiology here. So the categories are 1, biological/genetic, 2, pharmacological, 3, psychological, and 4, social. Number 1. So biological or genetic risk factors are things that we generally see as non-modifiable and fairly reliable risk factors. Even before any potential genes were implicated, it was known that psychiatric disorders, including schizophrenia, showed a substantial heritability. With schizophrenia, if you have a first-degree relative who has schizophrenia, your odds of having it increase by tenfold, so up to about 10% from 1%. If you have an identical twin with schizophrenia, your chance of having schizophrenia is 30 to 50%, again, compared to 1% or less in the general population. The fact that this number is significantly higher than if you have a non-identical twin with schizophrenia, which would be about 15%, is how scientists have long known that genetics, rather than simply a shared environment, play a significant role. So genes are clearly important here, but on the other hand, they're not everything. If schizophrenia were a purely genetic disorder, then having an identical twin with schizophrenia would mean you have a 100% chance of also having schizophrenia, because identical twins share 100% of their DNA. Since the advent of molecular genetic techniques, it's been found that there is a very broad swath of genetic polymorphisms that each contribute a very, very small amount of risk for schizophrenia, but no smoking gun of a single gene or polymorphism that massively increases your likelihood. So it's more about how many of these hundreds or thousands of potential risk polymorphisms, how many of them you end up with is sort of your genetic loading of risk. The one possible exception of a significant single genetic pathway, albeit not a single on-off gene for schizophrenia, is the complement pathway. Without going into depth or complexity, there's some interesting work here about the role of the immunologic complement system in synaptic pruning in childhood and adolescent development, and some evidence that an overactive pruning of neuronal synapses is a significant biological pathway that underlies schizophrenia, with genetic variants in that immune complement system accounting for that mechanism. So for Jared Loughner, we don't have any genetic studies, of course. The way to infer a genetic risk would be to consider whether there is a family history of schizophrenia. To my knowledge, there is no evidence of any relatives in the Loughner family who've been said to have schizophrenia, but there's, of course, the caveat that the family has always been rather private, so I don't think they would have necessarily volunteered that information if it were the case. So essentially, this is an unknown for him. So category 2 is the pharmacological pathway. So there is rather convincing evidence that cannabis use, at least in people who have a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, that cannabis use can precipitate the onset of schizophrenia. Now, the problem is there's no controlled way to know whether the abundant numbers of people that seem to get schizophrenia after a heavy period of cannabis use would have gotten schizophrenia anyways. You can't really do that controlled study, right? But there definitely seems to be an association between cannabis use and psychosis and later schizophrenia, both in clinical experience and in large observational studies. So, for example, here's a paper from 2018, Cannabis Use and Risk of Schizophrenia by Voucher et al. So in this study, they actually start with a meta-analysis of observational studies looking at the association between cannabis use and schizophrenia. So here they have one prospective study that was the most stringent, showed an odds ratio of 1.5, meaning that if you'd ever used cannabis, your odds were 1.5 times as high as someone who had never used cannabis. They then added that study to a meta-analysis of other prospective observational studies, found that ever use of cannabis was associated with a 43% increase in the risk of schizophrenia. Here's a graphical representation of the meta-analysis. So always coming up to pretty close to 1.5 times the odds of getting schizophrenia if you had ever smoked cannabis. What they then did was just read it from the abstract. So then they had 30-some thousand and 40-some thousand people with schizophrenia versus controls. And they found that in this sample, use of cannabis was associated with increased risk of schizophrenia at an odds ratio of about 1.4, corresponded with that meta-analysis of the observational studies. The prior studies matched their sample pretty closely. But what they could then do was look for whether the genetics of these people would account for both using cannabis and getting schizophrenia, but they did not find pleiotropic effects. So they did not find genes that merely increased the risk of both of these things. There was an independent pathway between genes increasing your risk of schizophrenia and cannabis increasing your risk of schizophrenia. Tobacco also did not alter this. So in other words, they looked for things that would otherwise explain the association between cannabis and schizophrenia, including genetics or use of tobacco, and the association remained that cannabis increased the risk of schizophrenia. Here's one from the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, Cannabis and Psychosis. So this is a review paper, talks about some of the large registry studies. So countries that have like a national healthcare registry can look at emergency department visits and later diagnoses. So in Denmark, for example, if you look at patients who came to the emergency department and got a substance-induced psychotic disorder diagnosis, meaning they came in because they were psychotic and it was found to be due to a substance. If that substance was cannabis, there was a 41% chance that that person would later have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Other studies have also shown high conversion of cannabis-induced psychotic disorder to schizophrenia. In Sweden, cannabis-induced psychosis had the highest conversion rate of all substances at 18%. In Finland, out of 20,000 cases, people with cannabis-induced psychotic disorder had 46% chance of later converting to schizophrenia. That was the highest percentage of any substance. And in Scotland, 20%. So what these multiple countries with large registries are telling us is that if you get a cannabis-induced psychosis, you have somewhere from a 1 in 5 to 1 in 2 chance of getting a diagnosis of schizophrenia later in life. Now this is actually a table of other studies that have looked into the relationship between THC, CBD, and schizophrenia or psychosis. They're going to have different ways of defining whether it's causative, because they're not going to be able to do a double-blind placebo-controlled trial where they give some people cannabis and they don't give others cannabis and they follow them to see who gets schizophrenia. That's just not viable. But like that first paper we looked at, there are other ways to establish likely causality. If you control for multiple other factors, you can just see the number of studies where there is thought to be a causative or otherwise exacerbating effect of cannabis on schizophrenia or psychosis. One thing I will say is that cannabidiol has been shown in several studies to counteract the effect of THC in cannabis. So I've heard that anecdotally as well, that cannabidiol can actually improve psychotic symptoms. But THC seems highly suspect as a causal factor in schizophrenia. And there is the argument that maybe the reason people who go on to develop schizophrenia so often have a history of heavy cannabis use is because they were maybe self-medicating the symptoms of psychosis with cannabis. However, this always struck me as odd because a very common symptom of psychosis is paranoia, and paranoia is also a pretty common side effect of cannabis intoxication. So why would someone be self-medicating paranoia with a substance that could also cause paranoia? Now, I know many people will say, well, cannabis actually just relaxes me and doesn't cause any paranoia. Let me just say, if you have any family history of schizophrenia, or if you've ever gone into a temporary state of psychosis in the past, talk to your doctor about whether cannabis is right for you. Be careful, okay? Now, for Jared Loughner, he definitely acknowledged his own heavy use of cannabis, including during an entrance interview for Army recruitment. He was also referred to as a pothead or stoner type back in high school by people that knew him. But there were also other substances he was using, including LSD, cocaine, mushrooms, and something called Salvia Divinorum, or salvia for short. And in fact, the overlap between the effects of this substance, salvia, and the apparent symptoms of Jared Loughner's psychosis is an observation the New York Times made in an article they published called "Shooting Suspect Had Been Known to Use Potent and Legal Hallucinogen." So at the time in 2011, salvia was not really regulated. It had just come to the US and it was available in head shops pretty commonly, I think. And so one of Jared's friends said about Jared Loughner, he always had it on him, meaning salvia. I guess he always had some on him. And here's where they talk about how closely the typical effects of smoking salvia match with Mr. Loughner's comments about how he saw the world, like his assertion that he spent most of his waking life in a dream world that he could control. Salvia is known for producing these dreamlike alternate realities, out-of-body experiences, the revelation of secret knowledge. Honestly, a lot of this just sounds like psychosis to me, but maybe with this particular kind of surreal, out-of-body like perceptual change. Here, the New York Times article says people who have smoked the herb say the experience is often unpleasant and many never use it again. And the powerful effects were documented in thousands of online videos documenting experiences on the drug, including made it all the way to Miley Cyrus, who was in a semi-viral video at the time where she was laughing hysterically and babbling nonsense after smoking something. It came out that it was salvia, apparently. And I actually, I remember this. There was this sort of fad on YouTube of all these people at the time, like filming their friend smoking some salvia, and you'd see this moment where the friend clearly just was gone, no longer responding to the people around them, just maybe laughing or maybe panicking, looking terrified, but one way or the other, clearly just in another world, not knowing what was going on. And then it would last only like a few minutes. It was a quick onset, quick offset. So then, yeah, here's a quote. "It pretty much puts you in a different world," says Casey Hazelton, 19, describing his own experience with the drug while visiting a local smoke shop. I wonder, I wonder how Casey Hazelton feels about people Googling his name, and he's forever going to be associated with saying that smoking salvia puts you in a different world. I don't know. The internet's strange, right? But yeah, he says it's like you're dreaming if you're awake. So again, maybe a particularly surreal kind of hallucinogen. Again, they all seem like they're surreal to me, though. But I think it's pretty intense. I think it may be one of the most intense in terms of the complete loss of awareness of the self and the complete immersion into this dream world. Like you don't even know you're a person anymore. That kind of hallucinogen. Sort of like DMT, probably. I think it's like on that level of hallucinogen. But I think for any one of these hallucinogens, and I would actually consider high potency THC to be a hallucinogenic to a degree. It seems like these substances can take people through a door in their perceptions, right? The doors of perception. And it seems that some people don't actually come back through that door. And if what's on the other side is a psychotic state, a waking dream where thoughts are not connected in the ways that we can understand back on this side of the door, this is psychosis. And if they stay in that state for longer than 6 months, it's going to be called schizophrenia. And so I do think that one of the significant risk pathways to schizophrenia seems to be a substance-induced psychosis that for some reason becomes durable or fixed. There's a substance-induced psychosis that wears off, but sometimes it doesn't, right? Does it happen to everyone? No, certainly doesn't seem to. My sense is that there are predispositions, pre-existing risk factors, genetic or earlier environmental risk factors that define your starting point They define where you are on this susceptibility towards going into schizophrenia. And so for people that have a very high biological loading, high pre-existing risk factors, maybe it doesn't take any use of substances to just end up going into schizophrenia. Maybe it was almost predestined, or just one little environmental stressor is what precipitates it. For some people with a very low predisposition, very low biological loading, maybe they can do as many substances as they want for as long as they want, and they're just not going to get schizophrenia. But it's those people in the middle, right? People with a certain loading, maybe if you're here, enough repeated and heavy substance use is maybe going to tip you over the edge. And if you're higher up in your predisposition, maybe only a little substance use. Then of course, if you're up here, it doesn't matter whether you use substances, you were just going to get it, unfortunately, right? So you can kind of think of this in either psychological or biological terms. In psychological terms, if you think about what you believe is reality, and then you think about a drug bringing you into an altered state, usually that state wears off. But then if you do it again, and then you start doing it so frequently that you're in the altered state more often than you're in the normal state, is there a point at which you just start believing that the altered state is reality? You start fundamentally believing that. And it does seem like you could see Jared Loughner's increasing obsession with conscious dreaming this way, that salvia and or other hallucinogens were putting him in this dream state. And if he was in that state often enough, he actually recapitulated his view of the world such that this dream was now his reality. And he was outright telling his friends, "I'm conscious dreaming." He would say that. But so maybe there was this recapitulation, this transition in his mind/brain of the drug-induced psychosis, previously temporary, suddenly becoming permanent. There was this frame shift. Oh, this is the real reality, right? The dream world. And then he couldn't go back. So that's sort of thinking of it psychologically, of the substance-induced psychosis becoming permanent based on a frame shift psychologically. I think the same process could also be viewed as happening on the level of the brain, simultaneous with what's happening on the level of the psyche. So let's think about what it would mean in the brain. There's long been a notion in pop culture, that people can fry their brains on drugs, right? There was that 90s advertisement, this is your brain on drugs, with the frying egg. But I actually think that commercial came from what was already a kind of folk wisdom, that drugs fried people's brains. I think that idea was already out there, and the commercial just made a visual of it. But I think people would say for a long time, like, "Oh, whatever happened to old Uncle Jimmy? Oh, he fried his brain on drugs. Oh, he just fried his brain on drugs," But how accurate might that folk wisdom have been? Well, the idea of frying, this would basically imply that something structural is happening to the brain, right? Like if you fry your computer by spilling water on it, or if a lightning strike fries your TV, what we mean is there was physical damage to the electrical hardware, right? Now, in the case of drugs frying your brain, if there is physical damage to the electrical circuitry, we can't see it, at least not right now. We can't see it on a CT scan the way you could with a stroke, where there's damage from the insult. You can see that. Now, there are changes in schizophrenia over the long term that we can see on imaging. They're general things like global atrophy, maybe a little more in the front. There's decreased connectivity. But again, these things are sort of global, and they're not specific to the cause of schizophrenia being drugs. It happens regardless of the cause of schizophrenia, it seems, right? So it's not going to tell you anything about whether the substances did it. It seems to be part of the schizophrenia. But there may come a time, as neuroimaging becomes more powerful and there comes an increasing ability to map out finely detailed connections between neurons, that maybe we do recognize a phenomenon like drug-induced encephalopathy where the consequence is chronic psychosis, what we now call schizophrenia. Okay, so all of that was in the pharmacological category of risk, right? Though I did go into some of the psychology of what would be going on from the substances. Let's now move to probably an even more controversial hypothesis, which is that there may be a category or an avenue of schizophrenia risk that is psychological in nature. Okay, so with Jared Loughner, we have at least one person saying that even pre-bizarreness, he was arrogant about his abilities as a saxophonist, right? Now, maybe that means nothing, normal stuff, but maybe it suggests a trait of some narcissism, right? And so narcissism, which is one of the cluster B personality traits, is essentially a defense against some core wound, some lack of a core stable identity. Borderline personality disorder, also in cluster B, also has at the core a wound and a lack of stable identity. In fact, Otto Kernberg said that a narcissist is a borderline with a narcissistic shield, meaning that the core is the same in both cases, and that is a core of unstable identity or core emptiness. But in narcissism, there's this shield. That's the only difference. And the shield is the grandiose self-image, whereas in borderline personality disorder, the core is essentially more exposed. It's unshielded. But having that kind of emptiness to the core self, I would suggest, is a psychological risk factor for psychosis. And it's fairly well agreed upon that in borderline personality disorder, at least, the one where there's not a shield, there can be a psychosis or psychotic-like state that happens transiently under stress, maybe specifically when the core wound is reactivated, like by abandonment or rejection, let's say, but a kind of psychosis. In fact, the reason it was originally named borderline in the old psychoanalytic days was that it was conceived as being on the borderline between neurosis and psychosis. So that tenuous position on the border, at risk of going into a psychotic state. Now, I would suggest that similar to a repetitive temporary psychosis of the kind that can happen from repetitive drug use, there can be a repetitive temporary psychosis from abandonment events or other interpersonal stressors for people with a core psychological wound, as in borderline or narcissistic disorders, and that perhaps this too can at some point switch from something transient to something permanent. If the stress is chronic, right, and there's stress-induced psychosis, then maybe there's a point at which the psychosis becomes chronic, right? And that looks like schizophrenia. With Jared Loughner, he had maybe an abandonment wound from the breakup with his girlfriend in 10th grade, which interacted with whatever biological predisposition he may have had, and then led to maladaptive coping mechanisms he used after that abandonment event, namely the heavy use of alcohol and drugs. And then incidentally, once he's in that psychotic state, he definitely seemed to have extreme reactions to interpersonal rejections, kind of psychotic level narcissistic injuries, as I talked about in that first video. But so here's a question. Given that I'm proposing that there's a domain of risk for psychosis that is in our psychological makeup, are there things we can do to mollify this risk? I think maybe there are. And I'm going to suggest something which may sound like spiritual mumbo jumbo, but I at least believe it, which is, do not lose sight of the part of yourself that is eternal. Okay, because if it feels like there's nothing but emptiness at your core, I would say that is actually an illusion of modern society and maybe your upbringing or early childhood. But what is actually there is something enduring, something that somehow is more than machinery. And we are not meant to ignore this. Look, we're all conscious here, right? And what is consciousness? I don't know, but I think it's more like light than it is like matter. And light is the same light everywhere and through all time. And so staying anchored to that part of yourself that is more like light than like machinery is very important, in my opinion. Okay, but on a more practical level, another thing is to maintain social supports. Have friends of some sort, so that you can also endure being abandoned by one person, should that happen, without ending up feeling completely alone and risk having your identity collapse. Those are sort of the conclusions I would come from based on the psychological risk factors, if those are in fact risk factors we just talked about. And this social supports part actually transitions me into risk category number 4, which is the social category, or the social avenue. And I'm going to start by talking about Charles Bonnet syndrome. Charles Bonnet syndrome. So this is actually a medical condition typically encountered in ophthalmology or neurology, not psychiatry, but it is defined by visual hallucinations, often complex visual hallucinations of people, scenery, sometimes the same little play being enacted over and over again. But what it's also defined by is the fact that it starts only after a person who had sight has lost some or all of their eyesight. So it happens in advanced cataracts, for example. And the explanation for this is that your brain at that point has all of this dedicated visual cortex space that suddenly has had its inputs removed. And so that part of the brain ends up spontaneously generating activity because it can't just sit there and do nothing, I guess. So you end up seeing all of these things that your visual cortex is inventing for or something to do. So I would propose that all of us also have a social cortex, at least as distributed throughout our brain. And that typically receives social inputs, analogous to the visual cortex receiving inputs of visual stimuli. But so when someone becomes completely isolated from social connections, those inputs get removed. And so what might happen? Well, isn't it interesting that in schizophrenia, the hallucinations are almost always voices talking? Very rarely it's singing, and even rarer are the hallucinations mechanical noises or anything non-communicative. So that to me sounds like maybe a social hallucination even more than an auditory hallucination. It's a social hallucination specifically, voices talking. And now maybe this is more of a stretch, but with some of the classical delusions, like being targeted by a shadowy organization, maybe there is still something even there that's filling a social role. Because the notion is that people care about you, right? The CIA or the FBI, or even if people have some nefarious purpose towards you, I wonder if that's still something to the social brain, better than the idea that just no one cares about you, no people are thinking about you or even know you exist. That would be essentially a blank space and total lack of activity in the social cortex, right? So this is a potential pathway that I haven't really heard anyone else theorize about, this idea of a social Charles Bonnet syndrome. And again, I'm not saying that social isolation is all it takes to develop schizophrenia, but I think it's something that could interact in a significant way with the other risk factor pathways. And probably it often ends up playing at least an exacerbating role. Like in the case of Jared Loughner, it seems that when he was already having some significant symptoms of psychosis, his old friends ended up kind of ignoring him and being freaked out by him, right? But that then eventually led to his just being a total loner for several years. So unfortunately, I think if you're having some psychosis symptoms that are off-putting to others, your subsequent isolation is almost inevitable, and that's then going to make it much worse. You're essentially going from early psychosis symptoms to getting exposures to these psychological and social risk factors of rejection and isolation that are going to substantially elevate your risk, in my opinion. And so things could end up getting a lot worse, right? Again, I think social connections are very important. Let's support each other as best we can, right? And try not to let people fall so far afield